Imagine sitting in a courtroom where justice is supposed to live and watching a uniformed officer violently drag a quiet black woman from the front row without asking her name, without knowing her title. Now imagine the whole room freezing as a federal judge shouts, "You just assaulted the new chief of police." This isn't fiction. It happened in Richmond, Virginia. And what came next pulled the curtain back on 25 years of silence, buried case files, and unpunished power. If you ever wondered how deep injustice runs in this country, or what it looks like when a system is finally held accountable, you need to watch this story to the very end. It's not just about one man's fall, it's about a nation waking up. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see how far the truth can reach today. It was 8:15 a.m. when the ceiling fans in Courtroom 2 at the Henrico County Courthouse spun with a lazy indifference. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, casting a pale wash of white across polished oak benches. The room was packed, not with media, not with family, but with anticipation. Something felt off, like the calm before a southern storm that never asked permission. Lieutenant Bradley Mercer stood like a monument near the courtroom entrance, arms crossed, his uniform starched to perfection. He wasn't just a cop, he was the cop, a 25-year veteran who carried more medals than remorse. His boots tapped the tile floor like the ticking of a slow-burning fuse. Then his eyes landed on her. A black woman dressed in a cream blouse and dark slacks sat in the front row, calm, composed, no name tag, no press badge, no signs of status, just dignity, quiet as a hymn. To Mercer, that was a red flag. Who did she think she was? Sitting there like she belonged, like she had authority in a place that, for decades, had been his. He stormed forward, each footstep louder than the last. The courtroom, until then buzzing in whispers, fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. "You think this is a damn circus?" Mercer barked, loud enough to echo. His voice was sharp, aged with authority, but steeped in something colder. He jabbed a finger. "Get up, get out, now!" Gasps rippled like wind across wheat. An elderly woman clutched her chest. A young law student fumbled for her notebook. The air thickened. But the woman didn't move, didn't blink. She just tilted her head, not in defiance but in understanding, like she had seen this exact moment before. Mercer's fingers clenched. He didn't care who she was. She wasn't following his rules. He grabbed her by the arm. Firm, final. The kind of grip that says, "I am the law." Then in 1 second, everything shifted. The judge rose from the bench, robe flaring like thunderclouds. His voice cracked like a gavel striking steel. "Lieutenant Mercer, you just assaulted the chief of police of Richmond, Dr. Naomi Ellison." The silence that followed didn't feel like quiet. It felt like history pausing for breath. Phones flew up. Eyewitnesses stared in disbelief. And Mercer, this towering figure of order, stood frozen, his grip still on the woman's wrist, as if his brain hadn't caught up with his fate. Naomi Ellison rose, adjusted her collar, and walked out. Not in anger, not in fear, but with a stillness that cut deeper than any scream. And just like that, a system cracked. The courtroom didn't breathe. For a moment, it felt like someone had shut off the air, like time itself refused to move. Lieutenant Bradley Mercer stood in the front of that room, still gripping the arm of Dr. Naomi Ellison, now known to everyone as the newly appointed chief of police for the city of Richmond. And just like that, his years of decorated service turned to dust. He didn't let go immediately. He couldn't. His hand, the same one that had once been praised for saving lives, now trembled, locked in place not by defiance, but by disbelief. Around him, no one moved. Not the clerk, not the officers in the back. Even the judge, still towering behind the bench, had stopped speaking. It was the kind of silence that doesn't forget. Naomi didn't jerk her arm back. She didn't scream. She simply looked at him, eyes calm, level, and deeply human. The kind of look that doesn't need to say, "You've gone too far." It lets the truth do all the talking. And Mercer? He suddenly looked smaller than his medals. A law student in the back row whispered, "My God, he really didn't know." Another shaking hit record on her phone. She wasn't even sure why, only that this moment right here was no longer a courtroom drama. It was real. It was history catching someone mid-lie. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured but unforgiving. "Lieutenant Mercer, unhand the chief immediately. You have violated both legal protocol and basic decency." The words landed like bricks. Mercer slowly released his grip, as if the consequences had weight, as if letting go meant he finally felt it. Naomi didn't look for applause. She didn't glance back. She simply straightened her sleeve and walked out of the courtroom, heels clicking softly, head high, like someone who had nothing to prove, because truth was already trailing behind her like a long, heavy shadow. Behind her, Mercer stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his heart hammered in his chest like a warning bell. No one rushed to defend him, not the other officers, not the clerk, not even the friends who had once slapped his back in the break room and called him the iron spine of the force. One by one, the room began to shift. Phones buzzed. Screens lit up. The video of Mercer grabbing Naomi was already making its way across social media. On Twitter, a reporter posted a clip with the caption, "Richmond's new police chief dragged from courtroom by her own officer. #mirror protocol." Within minutes, the hashtags multiplied. Within hours, the press was waiting outside. Inside the station, whispers turned to murmurings, then to full-throated questions. How could he not know? Did he really think no one would speak up? But those who had worked with Mercer for years already knew the answer. He'd been untouchable. Untouchable for so long, he forgot to look down. And now the badge he wore like armor had cracked. Not from violence, from truth. Naomi didn't go to the press that day. She didn't issue a statement. Instead, she returned to her office, the one with nothing but a desk, a pen, and the memory of a father who had once been shot in the same city she now served. And on her desk, she laid down a handwritten note from a boy named Elijah Porter. A boy hurt by the same hand that had grabbed her in court. This wasn't the end. It was just the start of the reckoning. Bradley Mercer had always been the kind of officer they gave plaques to. You could still see them, lined across his office wall like shields, glinting gold under dim hallway lights. For distinguished service, for community integrity. But those plaques, once polished with pride, now looked more like headstones for truths buried too deep. Back at the precinct, no one dared speak his name aloud that morning. The man who once stood as the department's hammer had just become its crack in the mirror. And the person holding that mirror? Naomi Ellison. She hadn't been on the job more than 24 hours. Yet in that short span, she had revealed a rot no one wanted to face. Not because they didn't know, but because pretending kept things easier, safer. Naomi sat at her new desk, sparse, cold, the drawers still creaky from years of dust. No photos yet, no framed degrees, just a pen, a notebook, and a thick, worn manila folder labeled EJ45. She opened it again. Elijah Porter, age 16, Richmond Public High School, honor roll, shot put captain. And now, a shoulder shattered in a police restraint that lasted less than 10 seconds. The file was thin, suspiciously thin. One page, no photos, no statements, no medical follow-up, just Mercer's report. Subject displayed erratic behavior and resisted lawful detainment. Minimal force used, no misconduct found. Signed, closed, filed away. Except Naomi had seen this pattern before. She'd worked on federal task forces from Detroit to Ferguson. She knew the codes officers used when they didn't want to write the truth. Minimal force, non-compliant, unsubstantiated injury. Each phrase polished to sound professional, but everyone a dagger through someone's future. Elijah hadn't even been arrested, just detained, long enough to dislocate a shoulder and fracture trust that would take a lifetime to rebuild. Naomi leaned back in her chair. She didn't need a memo to tell her what had happened. She'd lived through it, once as a 9-year-old girl clutching her father's bloodied shirt on a sidewalk in Church Hill, and now again, in the words of a report that smelled more like cover-up than accountability. She needed help. She called Marcus Mendoza, a young officer, smart, quiet, clean record, not yet poisoned by politics. When he stepped into her office, his shoulders were stiff, his eyes cautious. "I think you already know what I'm going to ask," Naomi said, not looking up. Marcus nodded. "You want the logs?" "I want everything. Access reports, terminal logs, anyone who touched this file in the last 5 years." He hesitated. She understood. Asking for logs wasn't routine. It was personal. It meant questioning people Marcus had trained under, had eaten lunch beside. But after a long pause, he simply said, "I'll get it, but if I pull this thread, Chief, it's not going to stop at Mercer." Naomi looked him in the eyes for the first time that day. "I'm counting on that." 2 days later, Marcus returned. He didn't knock, just came in quietly and laid a folder on her desk. File EJ45 was edited at 2:14 a.m. He said, "No scheduled personnel, no audit trail. Terminal registered as admin T. Same dummy account used to close 3 other injury complaints." Naomi flipped the pages. There it was. An invisible hand had scrubbed the system, erasing the pain of a teenager like it was just another typo. "Did you find out who created that account?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not yet, but I did find something else." He handed her a photocopy of a faded email, sent from a now-defunct department address, a message between 2 former supervisors. The subject line read, "Quick resolution needed. This one can't go public." Underneath Mercer's name. Naomi closed the folder slowly. She didn't speak for a full minute, because she knew this wasn't about one kid or one cop. This was about a pattern, a culture, a structure built to protect itself before the people it swore to serve. That's what made Mercer dangerous, not because he was a monster, but because the system had taught him he wasn't doing anything wrong. She stood, took the folder, and walked to the department's archive room. Past the security office, down a hallway no one used unless they had something to hide. There, in the last cabinet, she found a locked drawer labeled Closed Complaints, 2014 to 2020. She slid in the key Marcus had found taped beneath the IT desk. The drawer groaned. Inside, 47 files, all tagged with the same initials in the top right corner. BM Bradley Mercer. Naomi exhaled. Her hand hovered over the first file. Then she pulled it out. And in that moment, in a room lit only by flickering fluorescent light and the heat of buried names, the Mirror Protocol was born. Elijah Porter was the kind of boy people in the neighborhood rooted for. At just 16, he carried a maturity that felt years older. He ran track, made honor roll, and volunteered at the community center every Saturday. His mother, Geneva, a night shift nurse who worked herself ragged to keep the lights on, often called him her miracle baby. He was the kind of kid who asked how your day was going and meant it. But miracles, in places like their corner of Richmond, Virginia, often ran on borrowed time. It was a Wednesday evening in October 2018. The leaves had just started to fall. Elijah had stayed late at school for study group. He took the long way home, through a quiet stretch near Chamberlain Avenue, when a police cruiser slowed beside him. Inside was Officer Bradley Mercer. The encounter lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed everything. Mercer later claimed Elijah looked evasive. He didn't elaborate in his report. No call for backup, no search warrant, no witness, just his word. What neighbors heard, though, was yelling, then a sharp cry like someone being slammed into metal. Minutes later, Elijah was in handcuffs, his arm twisted behind his back, pain searing through his shoulder. He didn't resist. He didn't even understand why he was being stopped. But Mercer filed it as a standard detainment, checked the box for no injuries, and signed the form. The report was just 2 paragraphs long. By the time Geneva picked up her son from the precinct, his shirt was ripped at the collar, and he couldn't lift his arm. At the ER, the doctor confirmed a dislocated shoulder and multiple deep bruises across his upper back. Geneva demanded answers, but the desk sergeant shrugged. "Write it up," he said. So she did. She filed a formal complaint, stapled the medical documents to it, and submitted everything in person. She followed up every week. Phone calls, emails, even walking down to the department herself. And every time the response was the same, still under review. Until one day it wasn't. 6 weeks later, Geneva received a single sheet in the mail. Case number EJ45. Closed. Reason: Insufficient evidence. No one interviewed her. No one spoke to the ER doctor. No one asked Elijah what happened. For 5 years, the folder sat untouched beneath Geneva's kitchen sink, along with unpaid bills and expired coupons. Elijah stopped running track. He never went back to the community center. Something dimmed in him, a quiet, sad anger. He never spoke much about that night, but Geneva saw it in the way he flinched when he heard sirens, how he tensed up anytime headlights followed him too long. Years passed and the world moved on, but Elijah stayed stuck, still wondering why no one had cared, until the day Naomi Ellison walked into his mother's kitchen. Naomi, recently appointed as Richmond's new police chief, had spent her first weeks combing through past complaints linked to officers with multiple infractions. When she stumbled across case number EJ45, something didn't sit right. The report was thin, almost suspiciously so. She cross-referenced Mercer's activity logs and discovered 3 other cases closed in a similar fashion. No supporting documents, no camera footage, no discipline. She called Geneva personally. When Geneva opened the door, she was wary. She'd stopped expecting answers a long time ago. But Naomi didn't come with excuses. She asked to listen. They sat at the worn kitchen table while Elijah, now 21, watched from the hallway, arms folded. Geneva retrieved the old folder and laid it out, piece by piece. The complaint, the photos, the ER notes, and finally a page with Elijah's handwriting. It was the only statement he ever wrote about that night. Naomi read it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. "I said I didn't do anything," Elijah had written. "I was scared. I told him that. He didn't say I was under arrest. He just yelled, twisted my arm, and slammed me against the car. I thought I was going to black out. He called me a punk. Then he left me in the car with the window cracked like a dog." Naomi didn't say a word. That night, she went back to her office and ran a deeper audit. The internal system showed the file had been edited at 2:14 a.m., 3 days after the complaint was filed. The user? A ghost admin account. No name, no IP trail. She traced the same ghost edits on 2 other cases. Mercer's name was on all of them. Naomi didn't wait. She convened a small internal review team, people she trusted. They dug into radio logs, phone pings, badge swipe records. Mercer's body cam had malfunctioned that night. The cruiser dash cam, missing data. But Naomi's team found a pattern. The same missing data during similar stops, always involving young black men. Each one closed with minimal documentation. Each one approved by a now retired supervisor who had signed off on dozens of such files over the years. Naomi reached out to Elijah directly. He came to her office in a hoodie, shoulders tight. She offered him coffee, but he shook his head. She asked if he'd be willing to speak again, even if no one had listened before. "I don't think it'll change anything," he said, "but maybe someone younger than me won't have to wonder what they did wrong when they didn't do anything at all." His voice cracked near the end, but he didn't cry. Naomi recorded his statement. It became the first testimony in what she called Mirror Protocol, a project to reopen every case Mercer had touched in the past decade. She didn't make an announcement. She just started digging. Word spread. Other mothers came forward, other boys, and suddenly Elijah Porter, the kid who had once vanished from a report, was the boy whose story brought them all back. Geneva didn't smile when the department officially reopened the case, but that night as Elijah sat beside her on the couch, she reached for his hand and said, "You didn't disappear, baby. They just didn't want to see you. But now they have to." And Naomi, back in her office, took Elijah's statement and placed it on the wall next to a photo of her own father, a man who had died in silence without a file to reopen. Not this time. The first time Jalen Morris saw Elijah Porter's face on the local news, he dropped his coffee mug. It wasn't the story that shocked him. It was how familiar it all sounded. The quiet boy, the sudden stop, the missing footage, the file marked closed with no explanation. Jalen had lived it too, not just once. He had survived it. 7 years earlier, Jalen had been pulled over by Officer Mercer for a broken taillight. It was late. He was driving home from his second job, still wearing his maintenance uniform. Mercer didn't ask many questions, just told him to step out. Claimed he smelled marijuana, even though Jalen didn't smoke. He remembered how fast it escalated, being thrown against the hood, hands pinned behind his back, Mercer's voice barking commands he barely had time to process. Then came the discovery: 2 small bags of white powder in the trunk, stuffed between his toolbox and a jumper cable he'd used just that morning. Jalen had never seen them before. In court, he didn't stand a chance. Public defender, no money for bail, no family to testify, 2 years in prison, file marked resolved, a footnote in a system that never intended to look back. After his release, Jalen tried to move on, found work at an auto body shop, kept quiet, kept low. He thought maybe if he stayed invisible long enough, the past would forget him. But then Elijah's face showed up on the screen, and Naomi Ellison's name followed. A police chief who wasn't afraid to dig, a case being reopened, someone finally asking the right questions. It stirred something in Jalen he hadn't felt in years, rage and hope tangled in the same breath. He stayed up all night rereading his old court documents. The arrest report, the photographs, his intake form from county jail, still folded in the back of his sock drawer like a bitter souvenir. The next morning he showed up at police headquarters. He asked to speak to Naomi. She met him in a small office with a low ceiling and too many file boxes stacked against the walls. She didn't introduce herself with rank or title, just said, "I'm listening." Jalen laid it all out. The night he was arrested, the planted evidence, the voice in his ear saying, "You fight this, you'll never get out." He told her about the fear, not just of Mercer, but of the silence that came after. How nobody questioned anything. How everyone just let it happen. When he finished, Naomi didn't offer sympathy. She offered a pen. "Will you write it down?" she asked. He did. 3 pages. Shaky handwriting, but steady truth. Naomi filed it under a new case ID, not as a complaint, not as a favor, but as evidence. The very next day, she reopened Jalen's file. The system logs showed familiar tampering, midnight edits, redacted witness fields, a shell admin account that appeared again and again like a ghost haunting the server. She called in Marcus Delaney from IT, the one man on her team who had once risked his job to back up the Elijah Porter file. Together, they tracked the metadata, digital fingerprints Mercer and his allies never thought anyone would follow. At 3:17 a.m. on the night of Jalen's arrest, someone had accessed the case file from an unlisted terminal. The session lasted 12 minutes. Enough time to rewrite everything. Jalen's name was cleared internally by week's end, but that wasn't the end of it. Naomi held a press conference, small, no cameras allowed, just her, a podium, and the community advisory board. She told them Jalen Morris was convicted not because he was guilty, but because we didn't care to prove he was innocent. That ends now. Word spread fast. More people came forward. Old cases resurfaced. And Mercer? He wasn't seen in public for weeks. Naomi didn't care. She wasn't chasing him. She was chasing the truth he left behind. Jalen, now 33, stood outside the precinct 2 weeks later, watching the sun rise behind the old courthouse. For the first time in years, his shoulders were straight. A teenager passing by on a bike called out, "Hey, that you in the paper?" Jalen nodded. "What did you do?" He smiled, not bitter, not angry, just tired but proud. "I told the truth," he said, and this time someone listened. Naomi Ellison had seen many things behind a badge: courage, fear, silence. But nothing stayed with her more than the way silence could grow roots. Inside locker rooms, at morning briefings, in the way officers looked at her when she passed, eyes quickly turning away like she'd peeled back something they didn't want to see. When she walked into the internal records wing that morning, she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Every footstep on the polished floor sounded like a verdict. Marcus Delaney was already there, standing beside a file cart loaded with yellowed manila folders. Naomi's heart slowed when she saw the names. Not suspects, officers, some still on duty, some long retired. "These are the ones tied to Mercer," Marcus said quietly. "Same patterns, same midnight edits." She nodded. Her fingers brushed against the name at the top. Officer Dwight Holloway, 34 years on the force. A quiet man often praised for his stability. He had trained Mercer in his early years. Naomi remembered Holloway, not cruel, but always there when things got swept under rugs. She called him in. He walked into the office like it was any other day. Pressed uniform, steady steps. But Naomi saw the way his eyes flicked to the box on her desk. He knew. "Sit," she said. They didn't speak for the first few seconds, just air humming from the ceiling vent. Then Naomi laid down a printout, an internal access log. It showed Holloway logging into a restricted file at 2:11 a.m., 2 days after Jalen Morris was arrested. "You want to tell me why you touched a sealed file?" she asked. Holloway didn't flinch. "Because I was told to, by someone higher up." "Raleigh?" she asked. He hesitated, not out of fear but fatigue. "He told me it was just a cleanup, that the case had loose ends that needed tidying, and back then, and I didn't ask questions." Naomi leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Why are you here today?" His voice cracked for the first time. "Because I watched Jalen Morris testify, and I saw my son in him." He pulled out a folded photo from his wallet. His boy, 21, same age Jalen had been. "If someone did to him what we let happen to Jalen, I wouldn't want them protected by silence." Naomi didn't offer him absolution. She didn't pat his shoulder. She simply said, "Then testify, on record." He nodded, and for the first time, a badge that once stood guard over silence became a whisper in the fight for truth. Later that afternoon, Naomi gathered her core team: Marcus, Geneva, a community liaison named Rosa, and a young detective named Eddie, who had grown up just 5 blocks from Elijah Porter. She drew a circle on the whiteboard, and inside it wrote 2 words: "The wall." "Mercer wasn't the wall," she said. "He was the stone." The wall was built around him by men who stayed quiet, signed the reports, shifted blame. That's what we're taking down. One by one, names were added to the board. Not just bad actors, but silent ones. Enablers. Witnesses who blinked away guilt. Commanders who pushed files into pending drawers. And in the center, Mercer's badge number, surrounded by thin red lines. Naomi turned to her team. "This isn't about revenge. It's about roots. Pulling them out so nothing like this ever grows back." That evening, the Richmond sky turned a dusky orange. The streets were quiet, but inside precinct walls, something had shifted. Young officers whispered not with suspicion, but curiosity. Some started reviewing their own old cases. A few even knocked on Naomi's door with questions they'd never dared ask before. One placed a sealed envelope on her desk. No name. Inside, a flash drive. On it, audio files. Officer Mercer caught laughing in a locker room, bragging about how easy it was to get someone tossed when they didn't play along. Naomi listened once, then twice, then filed it into evidence. That night, she didn't sleep. She stood by her apartment window, watching streetlights flicker below, wondering how many stories were still buried in boxes, how many families still carried invisible wounds. But she knew this. Walls could crack, and whispers, when spoken together, could become thunder. Tomorrow, she would call a public hearing, and this time the system would sit in the witness chair. The hearing room at Richmond City Hall hadn't seen this kind of crowd in decades. Rows of oak chairs were filled with faces, some old, weathered by years of silence, some young, fresh with disbelief and fury. There were mothers with trembling hands clutching folded papers. There were men in worn suits, their eyes burning with stories long buried. There were cameras too, lined up along the back wall, waiting not for a headline, but for truth. And at the center of it all stood Naomi Ellison. She wore no uniform today, just a navy blazer and a soft gray scarf her grandmother had knit for her back when she graduated the academy. She wore it not for show, but for memory of those who'd once told her to stay small to stay safe. The moment she stepped to the microphone, the room quieted, not out of protocol, out of respect. She cleared her throat, steadying her voice. Today isn't about one officer or even 10. Today is about a pattern, a wall of silence that allowed harm to become habit. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Naomi didn't flinch. She clicked a remote, and behind her a screen lit up. A diagram appeared. Badge numbers, file codes, timestamps, all interconnected. This wall wasn't built overnight. It was built report by report. By every line someone didn't write, every complaint someone ignored, every mother turned away. Then came the files. Case EJ45. Elijah Porter, Case JM19, Jalen Morris. Others followed, one by one, some known, others never publicly acknowledged until this very moment. Naomi read snippets aloud, not for drama, but for dignity, for the names that never made the evening news, for the hands that had been cuffed before they were asked a single question. Midway through her presentation, she paused. This city trusted a system that was supposed to protect. But protection cannot exist without accountability. Justice does not bloom in the dark. A silence heavier than wood hung in the air. Then she called the first witness, Jalen Morris. He walked slowly, not because he was nervous, but because he was carrying something invisible. The weight of being believed at last. He placed a folded piece of yellowed paper on the table before him, his old intake sheet from county lockup. The same one he'd once thought would follow him forever. He looked straight ahead. I was never dangerous. I was never violent. But I was poor, and I was black. And that was enough for them to decide I didn't deserve to walk free. Gasps filled the room, but Naomi didn't let the emotions swell into spectacle. She called the next, Geneva Porter, Elijah's mother. She didn't speak with fury. She spoke like a woman who had waited too long for someone to ask her to tell the truth. My son didn't lose faith in the police, she said softly. He lost faith in the idea that truth matters. He still walks around with his head low, like he's waiting for someone to stop him for existing. Next came Marcus Delaney. He didn't tell a story. He read data, precise, undeniable. Timestamps, digital signatures, access logs. The room didn't need drama. The number spoke louder than any accusation. At the end of his testimony, he simply said, if a system forgets how to remember the truth, it stops being a system. It becomes a trap. Finally, Naomi turned toward the front row. A gray-haired man stood slowly, Lieutenant Dwight Holloway. For years, he had trained officers on procedure, had preached order. But today, his voice cracked with something different, remorse. I told myself silence kept me safe, but I watched young men get hurt, and I signed in papers I never questioned. That's my shame, and today I place it here, in the open. Naomi stepped beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder, not to absolve, but to acknowledge he had spoken. By the end of the day, the diagram on the screen had more red lines than anyone had expected. More cases, more dots, more names. No one left the hearing with applause. No banners were waved, but something heavier than claps filled the room, relief, and a quiet rage with direction now. That evening, outside City Hall, the wind blew hard down Broad Street, but people didn't scatter. They stayed. Jalen stood near the steps, watching the crowd. Beside him, Elijah leaned against a column, his shoulders still stiff some days. But tonight, he stood tall. You think anything's really going to change? Elijah asked. Jalen took a deep breath. The wall cracked today. Might not fall tomorrow, but it cracked, and that's more than we ever thought we'd see. From the rooftop, Naomi watched them from her window. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply whispered to herself, let the light in, even through the cracks. Because when a wall breaks, the world doesn't fall apart. It begins again. Weeks passed, the headlines faded, the hearings ended. But in the quiet spaces, in living rooms, barbershops, church pews, people kept talking. Not about scandal, but about change. Naomi Ellison sat alone in her office one evening, the last rays of a Virginia sunset casting soft gold across her desk. In the drawer beside her sat the old intake form from Jalen. Geneva's crumpled note, a printout of the log Marcus had recovered, artifacts of a history the system tried to bury. She didn't frame them. She didn't archive them. She kept them close, because they weren't relics, they were reminders. That silence is never neutral. That justice is not a moment, it's a choice. One that must be made again and again, even when the spotlight is gone. And sometimes the strongest light isn't the one that blinds, it's the one that stays. If this story stirred something in you, take a moment to ask yourself, what walls have we ignored for too long? Leave a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from, and what stories still deserve to be told where you live? Because truth doesn't belong to a courtroom. It belongs to all of us.